Okay, so here we are with chapter three, and here we're going to start talking about the basic underlying concepts of property, privacy, probable cause, and reasonableness. And before I get too deep into this, I want to go ahead and apologize ahead of time if I end up sneezing or having to blow my nose or something like that. I'm still trying to fight over this cold or flu or whatever it is. So, with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. Okay, so in the United States, our approach to the Fourth Amendment takes a property rights approach. And I want to go ahead and remind you all right now, whenever you see cases, especially cases in my slides, you want to look those cases up and read the syllabus of the court and the ruling by the court. That way you understand the backstory of what's going on and why the court ruled the way that they did. There are several cases in this chapter that I will emphasize that even if you don't read the other ones, you absolutely should read these. Um, so, with that, let's go ahead and get started here. So, the concept of privacy and property is a holdover from the English common law that's been vigorously enforced by our United States Supreme Court. You have to understand that at the time that our Constitution was written, and the amendments were added to the Constitution. Um, the amendments were added because the things that they restrict the government from doing is precisely what the English government was doing to the colonials. Okay, so um, like I was speaking of in class, the Third Amendment puts restrictions on the quartering of soldiers in private housing during peacetime without due compensation. Okay. So basically, what would happen at that time was the British Army would quarter an officer in the private homes of the colonials, and the colonials were expected to provide meals for the soldier, provide a bedroom or a living space for the soldier, to wash the soldier's laundry or whatnot, and things like this. And the thing was you were not consulted by British Army Command as to whether or not to even have a soldier quartered in your house or which soldier. So we had these problems like that. So hence the reason that the Congress passed the Third Amendment restricting the quartering of soldiers in private residences during peacetime without just compensation. Um, so you have to look at the changes in the criminal justice system through the lens of what was going on in history at the time. Okay, so moving on here, we see the first case on the slides here is Olmstead v. United States. And what you see there in the sub bullet point there below it where it says wiretap, that's merely a note for me to remind me about the case to speak to you about. But in this instance, law enforcement agents placed a wiretap on a private citizen's phone line, and then the information gleaned from the wiretap was used in court against them, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was not a violation of the Fourth Amendment because the wiretap was not installed directly on this citizen's private property. Since there was no intrusion to their private property, technically there was no search, and so they didn't rule it to be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Okay, so then fast forward about 15, 20 years to Goldman v. United States, and in this instance, they put like a listening device against a wall to listen through the wall into an adjoining office. And of course, kind of the same thing with the wiretap. The information gleaned from the listening device was used in court, and it was used against them, and it went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, not a violation of the Fourth Amendment because there was no intrusion into the defendant's private property. But then fast forward about another 20 years, and we have Silverman v. United States, where they used a spike mic, which basically penetrated the wall. And whenever they did that, the Supreme Court ruled that that was a violation of the Fourth Amendment and overturned what happened in this case. And then again, a couple years later in Clinton v. Virginia, there was a mechanical listening device planted in between the walls of an apartment building in order to listen in on private conversation going on in an adjoining apartment. And again, the Supreme Court ruled that that was a violation of the Fourth Amendment because it intruded on the privacy right or on the property rights of the individual. But it's also important to note here, you see that in 1961 in Silverman v. United States, that's where we see this shift occurring. And if you pay attention to your history, you understand that in 1961, the civil rights movement was spinning up in the United States. And then it was starting to get kind of full-fledged by 1964. So we have a lot of things going on here. Now, if you look in your textbooks, I believe it's on page 93, there's another case in there, United States v. Jones, and it's a 2012 case. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you look this case up, read the syllabus of the court, read the ruling of the court. This is a very recent case. It's so recent, in fact, that I actually cited it in my undergraduate work. And I actually use it on the street as a law enforcement officer. And so with United States v. Jones, essentially law enforcement officers low-jacked Jones's vehicle. They put a GPS tracking device on the vehicle. And the United States Supreme Court ruled that that was an unconstitutional violation of the Fourth Amendment because it was considered a search. Because one, it violated Kylo v. the United States, and it also it gave law enforcement information that they could not otherwise have obtained without obtaining a search warrant. And so they ruled that a search warrant was required. And of course, I mentioned a case there called Kylo v. United States. I'm not entirely sure if Kylo is mentioned in chapter 3, but I guarantee you it will be mentioned at some point in this textbook and in this course. So let me go ahead and knock that one out for you. Kylo v. United States is spelled Kylo, Kyllo. And in Kylo v. United States, a little background on that case. Some officers received an anonymous tip about possible drug activity going on in a house. And so they looked and found that the water bill was extraordinarily high. And I guess they had seen people taking in potting soil, but not seeing any plants coming out to be planted in the garden. And so the enterprising law enforcement officers that they were went and got a thermal imager, and they used a thermal imager on the house. They saw that the house was radiating heat much more so than adjoining or neighboring houses in the neighborhood. And so they used that information to obtain a search warrant and so on and so forth. And they went forth and conquered evil. And it made its way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, not so fast, young officers. You cannot use a technological advantage in order to enhance a human sense. Okay, so binoculars would be different because that's just lenses. Anybody has the ability to go and get binoculars from the store. That's just lenses. But to use something like thermal imagery, where you're actually using technology to see something that you would normally not see, that's a no-go under the Fourth Amendment through Kylo v. United States.